Ishaq al-Samarkandi. From Samarkand. 1466 to 1472 Afanasi Nakidish Nakidan. Years spent in India, 15th century, from Russia. 16th century. 1518 Duarte Barbosa, death point 1521, from Portugal. Visit to India. 1562 Sidi Ali Reis, from Turkey. Year of death. 1536 to 1600 Antonio Montserrat, from Spain. 17th century. 1626 to 1631 Mahmud Wali Baqi, from Balkh. Years spent in India. 1600 to 1667 Peter Mundy, from England. 1605 to 1689 Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, from France. 1620 to 1688 François Berny, from France. Source 1. Al-Biruni's Objectives. Al-Biruni described his work as a help to those who want to discuss religious questions with them, the Hindus, and as a repertory of information to those who want to associate with them. Read the excerpt from Al-Biruni and discuss whether his work met these objectives. Translating texts, sharing ideas. Al-Biruni's expertise in several languages allowed him to compare languages and translate texts. He translated several Sanskrit works, including Patanjali's work on grammar, into Arabic. For his Brahmana friends, he translated the works of Euclid, a Greek mathematician, into Sanskrit. Hindu. The term Hindu was derived from an Old Persian word, used c. 6th–5th centuries BCE, to refer to the region east of the river Sindhu, Indus. The Arabs continued the Persian usage and called this region Al-Hind and its people Hindi. Later the Turks referred to the people east of the Indus as Hindu, their land as Hindustan, and their language as Hindavi. None of these expressions indicated the religious identity of the people. It was much later that the term developed religious connotations. Source 2. The bird leaves its nest. This is an excerpt from the Rilla. My departure from Tangier, my birthplace, took place on Thursday. I set out alone, having neither fellow traveler nor caravan whose party I might join, but swayed by an overmastering impulse within me and a desire long cherished in my bosom to visit these illustrious sanctuaries. So I braced my resolution to quit all my dear ones, female and male, and forsook my home as birds forsake their nests. My age at that time was 22 years. Ibn Battuta returned home in 1354, about 30 years after he had set out. The lonely traveler. Robbers were not the only hazard on long journeys, the traveler could feel homesick, or fall ill. Here is an excerpt from the Rilla. I was attacked by the fever, and I actually tied myself on the saddle with a turban cloth in case I should fall off by reason of my weakness. So at last we reached the town of Tunis, and the townsfolk came out to welcome the sheikh and the son of the Qazi. On all sides they came forward with greetings and questions to one another, but not a soul said a word of greeting to me, since there was none of them I knew. I felt so sad at heart on account of my loneliness that I could not restrain the tears that started to my eyes, and wept bitterly. But one of the pilgrims, realizing the cause of my distress, came up to me with a greeting. Source 3. Education and Entertainment. This is what Ibn Juzay, who was deputed to write what Ibn Battuta dictated, said in his introduction. A gracious direction was transmitted, by the ruler, that he, Ibn Battuta, should dictate an account of the cities which he had seen in his travel, and of the interesting events which had clung to his memory, and that he should speak of those whom he had met, of the rulers of countries, of their distinguished men of learning, and their pious saints. Accordingly, he dictated upon these subjects a narrative which gave entertainment to the mind and delight to the ears and eyes, with a variety of curious particulars by the exposition of which he gave edification, and of marvelous things, by referring to which he aroused interest. In the footsteps of Ibn Battuta. In the centuries between 1400 and 1800, visitors to India wrote a number of travelogues in Persian. At the same time, Indian visitors to Central Asia, Iran, and the Ottoman Empire also sometimes wrote about their experiences. These writers followed in the footsteps of Al-Biruni and Ibn Battuta, and had sometimes read these earlier authors. Among the best known of these writers were Abdur Razak Samarkandi, who visited South India in the 1440s, Mahmud Wali Baqi, who travelled very widely in the 1620s, and Sheikh Ali Hazan, who came to North India in the 1740s. Some of these authors were fascinated by India, and one of them, Mahmud Baqi, even became a sort of sannyasi for a time. Others such as Hazan were disappointed and even disgusted with India, where they expected to receive a red carpet treatment. Most of them saw India as a land of wonders. Compare the objectives of Al-Biruni and Ibn Battuta in writing their accounts. Source 4. Traveling with the Mughal army. Biruni often travelled with the army. This is an excerpt from his description of the army's march to Kashmir. I am expected to keep 2 good Turkoman horses, and I also take with me a powerful Persian camel and driver, a groom for my horses, a cook, and a servant to go before my horse with a flask of water in his hand, according to the custom of the country. I am also provided with every useful article, such as a tent of moderate size, a carpet, a portable bed made of 4 very strong but light canes, a pillow, a mattress, round leather tablecloths used at meals, some few napkins of dyed cloth, 3 small bags with culinary utensils which are all placed in a large bag, and this bag is again carried in a very capacious and strong double sack or net made of leather thongs. This double sack likewise contains the provisions, linen, and wearing apparel, both of master and servants. I have taken care to lay in a stock of excellent rice for 5 or 6 days' consumption, of sweet biscuits flavored with anise, a herb, of limes, and sugar. Nor have I forgotten a linen bag with its small iron hook for the purpose of suspending and draining dahi or curds, nothing being considered so refreshing in this country as lemonade and dahi. The creation and circulation of ideas about India. The writings of European travelers helped produce an image of India for Europeans through the printing and circulation of their books. Later, after 1750, when Indians like Sheikh Isamuddin and Mirza Abu Talib visited Europe and confronted this image that Europeans had of their society, they tried to influence it by producing their own version of matters. A language with an enormous range. Al-Biruni described Sanskrit as follows. If you want to conquer this difficulty, i.e., to learn Sanskrit, you will not find it easy, because the language is of an enormous range, both in words and inflections, something like the Arabic, calling one and the same thing by various names, both original and derivative, and using one and the same word for a variety of subjects, which, in order to be properly understood, must be distinguished from each other by various qualifying epithets. God knows best. Travelers did not always believe what they were told. When faced with the story of a wooden idol that supposedly lasted for 216,432 years, Al-Biruni asks, how, then, could wood have lasted such a length of time, and particularly in a place where the air and the soil are rather wet? God knows best. Source 5. The System of Varnas. This is Al-Biruni's account of the system of Varnas. The highest caste are the Brahmana, of whom the books of the Hindus tell us that they were created from the head of Brahman. And as the Brahman is only another name for the force called nature, and the head is the highest part of the body, the Brahmana are the choice part of the whole genus. Therefore the Hindus consider them as the very best of mankind. The next caste are the Kshatriya, who were created, as they say, from the shoulders and hands of Brahman. Their degree is not much below that of the Brahmana. After them follow the Vaishya, who were created from the thigh of Brahman. The Shudra, who were created from his feet. Between the latter two classes there is no very great distance. Much, however, as these classes differ from each other, they live together in the same towns and villages, mixed together in the same houses and lodgings. Source 6. It's like a man's head. The following is how Ibn Battuta described the coconut. These trees are among the most peculiar trees in kind and most astonishing in habit. They look exactly like data palms, without any difference between them except that the one produces nuts as its fruits and the other produces dates. The nut of a coconut tree resembles a man's head, for in it are what look like two eyes and a mouth, and the inside of it when it is green looks like the brain, and attached to it is a fiber which looks like hair. They make from this cords with which they sew up ships instead of using iron nails, and they, also, make from it cables for vessels. Source 7. The Pawn. Read Ibn Battuta's description of the pawn. The beetle is a tree which is cultivated in the same manner as the grapevine. The beetle has no fruit and is grown only for the sake of its leaves. The manner of its use is that before eating it one takes areca nut, this is like a nutmeg but is broken up until it is reduced to small pellets, and one places these in his mouth and chews them. Then he takes the leaves of beetle, puts a little chalk on them, and masticates them along with the beetle. Source 8. Delhi. Here is an excerpt from Ibn Battuta's account of Delhi, often spelt as Delhi in texts of the period. The city of Delhi covers a wide area and has a large population. The rampart round the city is without parallel. The breadth of its wall is 11 cubits, and inside it are houses for the night sentry and gatekeepers. Inside the ramparts, there are storehouses for storing edibles, magazines, ammunition, ballistas, and siege machines. The grains that are stored, in these ramparts, can last for a long time, without rotting. In the interior of the rampart, horsemen as well as infantrymen move from one end of the city to another. The rampart is pierced through by windows which open on the side of the city, and it is through these windows that light enters inside. The lower part of the rampart is built of stone, the upper part of bricks. It has many towers close to one another. There are 28 gates of this city which are called Darwaza, and of these, the Budan Darwaza is the greatest. Inside the Mandwai Darwaza there is a grain market, adjacent to the Gul Darwaza there is an orchard. It, the city of Delhi, has a fine cemetery in which graves have domes over them, and those that do not have a dome, have an arch, for sure. In the cemetery they sow flowers such as tuberose, jasmine, wild rose, etc., and flowers blossom there in all seasons. Source 9. Music in the market. Read Ibn Battuta's description of Dulat Abat. In Dulat Abat there is a marketplace for male and female singers, which is known as Tarababad. It is one of the greatest and most beautiful bazaars. It has numerous shops and every shop has a door which leads into the house of the owner. The shops are decorated with carpets and at the center of a shop there is a swing on which sits the female singer. She is decked with all kinds of finery and her female attendants swing her. In the middle of the marketplace there stands a large cupola, which is carpeted and decorated and in which the chief of the musicians takes his place every Thursday after the dawn prayers, accompanied by his servants and slaves. The female singers come in successive crowds, sing before him and dance until dusk after which he withdraws. In this bazaar there are mosques for offering prayers. One of the Hindu rulers alighted at the cupola every time he passed by this marketplace, and the female singers would sing before him. Even some Muslim rulers did the same. A strange nation? The travelogue of Abdur Razak written in the 1440s is an interesting mixture of emotions and perceptions. On the one hand, he did not appreciate what he saw in the port of Calicut, present-day Kozhikode, in Kerala, which was populated by a people the likes of whom I had never imagined, describing them as a strange nation. Later in his visit to India, he arrived in Mangalore, and crossed the Western Ghats. Here he saw a temple that filled him with admiration. Within 3 leagues, about 9 miles of Mangalore, I saw an idol house the likes of which is not to be found in all the world. It was a square, approximately 10 yards aside, 5 yards in height, all covered with cast bronze, with 4 porticos. In the entrance portico was a statue in the likeness of a human being, full stature, made of gold. It had 2 red rubies for eyes, so cunningly made that you would say it could see. What craft and artisanship! Source 10. On horse and on foot. This is how Ibn Battuta describes the postal system. In India the postal system is of two kinds. The horse post, called Uluk, is run by royal horses stationed at a distance of every 4 miles. The foot post has 3 stations per mile, it is called Dawa, that is on at herd of a mile. Now, at every third of a mile there is a well-populated village, outside which are 3 pavilions in which sit men with girded loins ready to start. Each of them carries a rod, 2 cubits in length, with copper bells at the top. When the courier starts from the city he holds the letter in one hand and the rod with its bells on the other, and he runs as fast as he can. When the men in the pavilion hear the ringing of the bell they get ready. As soon as the courier reaches them, one of them takes the letter from his hand and runs at top speed shaking the rod all the while until he reaches the next dawa. And the same process continues till the letter reaches its destination. This foot post is quicker than the horse post, and often it is used to transport the fruits of Khorasan which are much desired in India. Do you think the foot post system could have operated throughout the subcontinent? Widespread poverty. Pelsaert, a Dutch traveller, visited the subcontinent during the early decades of the 17th century. Like Berni, he was shocked to see the widespread poverty so great and miserable that the life of the people can be depicted or accurately described only as the home of stark want and the dwelling place of bitter woe. Holding the state responsible, he says, so much is wrung from the peasants that even dry bread is scarcely left to fill their stomachs. Source 11. The Poor Peasant. An excerpt from Berni's description of the peasantry in the countryside. Of the vast tracts of country constituting the empire of Hindustan, many are little more than sand, or barren mountains, badly cultivated, and thinly populated. Even a considerable portion of the good land remains untilled for want of labourers, many of whom perish in consequence of the bad treatment they experience from governors. The poor people, when they become incapable of discharging the demands of their rapacious lords, are not only often deprived of the means of subsistence, but are also made to lose their children, who are carried away as slaves. Thus, it happens that the peasantry, driven to despair by so excessive a tyranny, abandon the country. In this instance, Berni was participating in contemporary debates in Europe concerning the nature of state and society, and intended that his description of Mughal India would serve as a warning to those who did not recognize the merits of private property. What, according to Berni, were the problems faced by peasants in the subcontinent? Do you think his description would have served to strengthen his case? A warning for Europe. Berni warned that if European kings followed the Mughal model, their kingdoms would be very far from being well cultivated and peopled, so well built, so rich, so polite and flourishing as we see them. Our kings are otherwise rich and powerful, and we must avow that they are much better and more royally served. They would soon be kings of deserts and solitudes, of beggars and barbarians, such as those are whom I have been representing, the Mughals. We should find the great cities and the great boroughs, rendered uninhabitable because of ill air, and to fall to ruin, without anybody, taking care of repairing them, the hillocks abandoned, and the fields overspread with bushes, or filled with pestilential marshes, as hath been already intimated. How does Berni depict a scenario of doom? Once you have read chapters 8 and 9, return to this description and analyze it again. Source 14. The Imperial Carcanis. Berni is perhaps the only historian who provides a detailed account of the working of the Imperial Carcanis or workshops. Large halls are seen at many places, called Carcanis or workshops for the artisans. In one hall, embroiderers are busily employed, superintended by a master. In another, you see the goldsmiths, in a third, painters, in a fourth, varnishers and lacquer work, in a fifth, joiners, turners, tailors and shoemakers, in a sixth, manufacturers of silk, brocade and fine muslins. The artisans come every morning to their carcanis where they remain employed the whole day, and in the evening return to their homes. In this quiet regular manner, their time glides away, no one aspiring for any improvement in the condition of life wherein he happens to be born. How does Berni convey a sense that although there was a great deal of activity, there was little progress? Source 15. Slave women. Ibn Battuta informs us. It is the habit of the emperor to keep with every noble, great or small, one of his slaves who spies on the nobles. He also appoints female scavengers who enter the houses unannounced, and to them the slave girls communicate all the information they possess. Most female slaves were captured in raids and expeditions. Source 16. The Child Sita. This is perhaps one of the most poignant descriptions by Berni. At Lahore I saw a most beautiful young widow sacrificed, who could not, I think, have been more than 12 years of age. The poor little creature appeared more dead than alive when she approached the dreadful pit. The agony of her mind cannot be described. She trembled and wept bitterly, but 3 or 4 of the Brahmanas, assisted by an old woman who held her under the arm, forced the unwilling victim toward the fatal spot, seated her on the wood, tied her hands and feet, lest she should run away, and in that situation the innocent creature was burnt alive. I found it difficult to repress my feelings and to prevent their bursting forth into clamorous and unavailing rage. Theme 6. Bhakti Sufi Traditions. Changes in religious beliefs and devotional texts. c. 8th to 18th century. We saw in Chapter 4 that by the mid-1st millennium CE the landscape of the subcontinent was dotted with a variety of religious structures, stupas, monasteries, temples. If these typified certain religious beliefs and practices, others have been reconstructed from textual traditions, including the Puranas, many of which received their present shape around the same time, and yet others remain only faintly visible in textual and visual records. New textual sources available from this period include compositions attributed to poet-saints, most of whom expressed themselves orally in regional languages used by ordinary people. These compositions, which were often set to music, were compiled by disciples or devotees, generally after the death of the poet-saint. What is more, these traditions were fluid. Generations of devotees tended to elaborate on the original message, and occasionally modified or even abandoned some of the ideas that appeared problematic or irrelevant in different political, social, or cultural contexts. Using these sources thus poses a challenge to historians. Historians also draw on hagiographies or biographies of saints written by their followers, or members of their religious sect. These may not be literally accurate, but allow a glimpse into the ways in which devotees perceived the lives of these path-breaking women and men. As we will see, these sources provide us with insights into a scenario characterized by dynamism and diversity. Let us look at some elements of these more closely. 1. A mosaic of religious beliefs and practices. Perhaps the most striking feature of this phase is the increasing visibility of a wide range of gods and goddesses in sculpture as well as in texts. At one level, this indicates the continued and even extended worship of the major deities Vishnu, Shiva, and the goddess, each of whom was visualized in a variety of forms. 1.1 The integration of cults. Historians who have tried to understand these developments suggest that there were at least 2 processes at work. One was a process of disseminating Brahmanical ideas. This is exemplified by the composition, compilation, and preservation of Puranic texts in simple Sanskrit verse, explicitly meant to be accessible to women and Shudras, who were generally excluded from Vedic learning. At the same time, there was a second process at work, that of the Brahmanas accepting and reworking the beliefs and practices of these and other social categories. In fact, many beliefs and practices were shaped through a continuous dialogue between what sociologists have described as great Sanskritic Puranic traditions and little traditions throughout the land. One of the most striking examples of this process is evident at Puri, Orissa, where the principal deity was identified, by the 12th century, as Jagannatha, literally, the Lord of the world, a form of Vishnu. If you compare figure 6.2 with figure 4.26, you will notice that the deity is represented in a very different way. In this instance, a local deity, whose image was and continues to be made of wood by local tribal specialists, was recognized as a form of Vishnu. At the same time, Vishnu was visualized in a way that was very different from that in other parts of the country. Such instances of integration are evident amongst goddess cults as well. Worship of the goddess, often simply in the form of a stone smeared with ochre, was evidently widespread. These local deities were often incorporated within the Puranic framework by providing them with an identity as a wife of the principal male deities. Sometimes they were equated with Lakshmi, the wife of Vishnu, in other instances, with Parvati, the wife of Shiva. 1.2 Difference and conflict. Often associated with the goddess were forms of worship that were classified as tantric. Tantric practices were widespread in several parts of the subcontinent. They were open to women and men, and practitioners often ignored differences of caste and class within the ritual context. Many of these ideas influenced Shaivism as well as Buddhism, especially in the eastern, northern and southern parts of the subcontinent. All of these somewhat divergent and even disparate beliefs and practices would come to be classified as Hindu over the course of the next millennium. The divergence is perhaps most stark if we compare Vedic and Puranic traditions. The principal deities of the Vedic pantheon, Agni, Indra, and Soma, become marginal figures, rarely visible in textual or visual representations. And while we can catch a glimpse of Vishnu, Shiva, and the goddess in Vedic mantras, these have little in common with the elaborate Puranic mythologies. However, in spite of these obvious discrepancies, the Vedas continued to be revered as authoritative. Not surprisingly, there were sometimes conflicts as well. Those who valued the Vedic tradition often condemned practices that went beyond the closely regulated contact with the divine through the performance of sacrifices or precisely chanted mantras. On the other hand, those engaged in tantric practices frequently ignored the authority of the Vedas. Also, devotees often tended to project their chosen deity, either Vishnu or Shiva, as supreme. Relations with other traditions, such as Buddhism or Jainism, were also often fraught with tension if not open conflict. The traditions of devotion or bhakti need to be located within this context. Devotional worship had a long history of almost 1,000 years before the period we are considering. During this time, expressions of devotion ranged from the routine worship of deities within temples to ecstatic adoration where devotees attained a trance-like state. The singing and chanting of devotional compositions was often a part of such modes of worship. This was particularly true of the Vaishnava and Shaiva sects. 2. Poems of prayer. Early traditions of bhakti. In the course of the evolution of these forms of worship, in many instances, poet saints emerged as leaders around whom there developed a community of devotees. Further, while Brahmanas remained important intermediaries between gods and devotees in several forms of bhakti, these traditions also accommodated and acknowledged women and the lower castes, categories considered ineligible for liberation within the orthodox Brahmanical framework. What also characterized traditions of bhakti was a remarkable diversity. At a different level, historians of religion often classify bhakti traditions into two broad categories: saguna, with attributes, and nirguna, without attributes. The former included traditions that focused on the worship of specific deities such as Shiva, Vishnu, and his avatars, incarnations, and forms of the goddess or Devi, all often conceptualized in anthropomorphic forms. 5. Nirguna bhakti, on the other hand, was worship of an abstract form of God. 2.1 The Alvars and Ayyanars of Tamil Nadu. Some of the earliest bhakti movements, c. 6th century, were led by the Alvars, literally, those who are immersed in devotion to Vishnu, and Nayanars, literally, leaders who were devotees of Shiva. They traveled from place to place singing hymns in Tamil in praise of their gods. During their travels, the Alvars and Nayanars identified certain shrines as abodes of their chosen deities. Very often large temples were later built at these sacred places. These developed as centers of pilgrimage. Singing compositions of these poet saints became part of temple rituals in these shrines, as did worship of the saints' images. 2.2 Attitudes towards caste. Some historians suggest that the Alvars and Nayanars initiated a movement of protest against the caste system and the dominance of Brahmanas, or at least attempted to reform the system. To some extent this is corroborated by the fact that Bhaktas hailed from diverse social backgrounds ranging from brahmanas to artisans and cultivators and even from castes considered untouchable. The importance of the traditions of the Alvars and Nayanars was sometimes indicated by the claim that their compositions were as important as the Vedas. For instance, one of the major anthologies of compositions by the Alvars, the 5 Alayyaradavya Prabandham, was frequently described as the Tamil Veda, thus claiming that the text was as significant as the 4 Vedas in Sanskrit that were cherished by the Brahmanas. 2.3 Women devotees. Perhaps one of the most striking features of these traditions was the presence of women. For instance, the compositions of Andal, a woman Alvar, were widely sung, and continue to be sung to date. Andal saw herself as the beloved of Vishnu, her verses express her love for the deity. Another woman, Karakal Ammayar, a devotee of Shiva, adopted the path of extreme asceticism in order to attain her goal. Her compositions were preserved within the Nayanar tradition. These women renounced their social obligations, but did not join an alternative order or become nuns. Their very existence and their compositions posed a challenge to patriarchal norms. 2.4 Relations with the state. We saw in Chapter 2 that there were several important chiefdoms in the Tamil region in the early 1st millennium CE. From the second half of the 1st millennium there is evidence for states, including those of the Pallavas and Pandyas, c. 6th to 9th centuries CE. While Buddhism and Jainism had been prevalent in this region for several centuries, drawing support from merchant and artisan communities, these religious traditions received occasional royal patronage. Interestingly, one of the major themes in Tamil Bhakti hymns is the poet's opposition to Buddhism and Jainism. This is particularly marked in the compositions of the Nayanars. Historians have attempted to explain this hostility by suggesting that it was due to competition between members of other religious traditions for royal patronage. What is evident is that the powerful Chola rulers, 9th to 13th centuries, supported Brahmanical and Bhakta traditions, making land grants and constructing temples for Vishnu and Shiva. In fact, some of the most magnificent Shiva temples, including those at Chidambaram, Tanjavur, and Gangaikondakolappuram, were constructed under the patronage of Chola rulers. This was also the period when some of the most spectacular representations of Shiva in bronze sculpture were produced. Clearly, the visions of the Nayanars inspired artists. Both Nayanars and Alvars were revered by the Velila peasants. Not surprisingly, rulers tried to win their support as well. The Chola kings, for instance, often attempted to claim divine support and proclaim their own power and status by building splendid temples that were adorned with stone and metal sculpture to recreate the visions of these popular saints who sang in the language of the people. These kings also introduced the singing of Tamil Shiva hymns in the temples under royal patronage, taking the initiative to collect and organize them into a text, Tavaram. Further, inscriptional evidence from around 945 suggests that the Chola ruler Parantaka I had consecrated metal images of Appar, Samba Ndar, and Sundarar in a Shiva temple. These were carried in processions during the festivals of these saints. 3. The Virashaiva tradition in Karnataka. The 12th century witnessed the emergence of a new movement in Karnataka, led by a Brahmana named Basavana, 1106-68, who was initially a Jaina and a minister in the court of a Kaluyukya king. His followers were known as Virashaivas, heroes of Shiva, or Lingayats, wearers of the Linga. Lingayats continue to be an important community in the region to date. They worship Shiva in his manifestation as a linga, and men usually wear a small linga in a silver case on a loop strung over the left shoulder. Those who are revered include the Jangama or wandering monks. Lingayats believe that on death the devotee will be united with Shiva and will not return to this world. Therefore they do not practice funerary rites such as cremation, prescribed in the Dharma Shastras. Instead, they ceremonially bury their dead. The Lingayats challenged the idea of caste and the pollution attributed to certain groups by Brahmanas. They also questioned the theory of rebirth. These won them followers amongst those who were marginalized within the Brahmanical social order. The Lingayats also encouraged certain practices disapproved in the Dharma Shastras, such as post-puberty marriage and the remarriage of widows. Our understanding of the Virashaiva tradition is derived from vachanas, literally, sayings, composed in Kannada by women and men who joined the movement. EU religious developments. This period also witnessed two major developments. On the one hand, many ideas of the Tamil Bhaktas, especially the Vaishnavas, were incorporated within the Sanskritic tradition, culminating in the composition of one of the best-known Puranas, the Bhagavata Purana. Second, we find the development of traditions of bhakti in Maharashtra in the 13th century. 4. Religious ferment in North India. During the same period, in North India deities such as Vishnu and Shiva were worshipped in temples, often built with the support of rulers. However, historians have not found evidence of anything resembling the compositions of the Alvars and Nayanars till the 14th century. How do we account for this difference? Some historians point out that in North India this was the period when several Rajput states emerged. In most of these states Brahmanas occupied positions of importance, performing a range of secular and ritual functions. There seems to have been little or no attempt to challenge their position directly. At the same time other religious leaders, who did not function within the orthodox Brahmanical framework, were gaining ground. These included the Naths, Yogis, and Siddhas. Many of them came from artisanal groups, including weavers, who were becoming increasingly important with the development of organized craft production. Demand for such production grew with the emergence of new urban centers, and long-distance trade with Central Asia and West Asia. Many of these new religious leaders questioned the authority of the Vedas, and expressed themselves in languages spoken by ordinary people, which developed over centuries into the ones used today. However, in spite of their popularity, these religious leaders were not in a position to win the support of the ruling elites. A new element in this situation was the coming of the Turks, which culminated in the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate, 13th century. This undermined the power of many of the Rajput states and the Brahmanas who were associated with these kingdoms. This was accompanied by marked changes in the realm of culture and religion. The coming of the Sufis was a significant part of these developments. 5. New strands in the fabric. Islamic traditions. Just as the regions within the subcontinent were not isolated from one another, so too, contact with lands beyond the seas and mountains had existed for millennia. Arab merchants, for instance, frequented ports along the western coast in the first millennium CE, while Central Asian peoples settled in the northwestern parts of the subcontinent during the same period. From the 7th century, with the advent of Islam, these regions became part of what is often termed the Islamic world. 5.1 Faiths of rulers and subjects. One axis of understanding the significance of these connections that is frequently adopted is to focus on the religions of ruling elites. In 711 an Arab general named Muhammad Qasim conquered Sind, which became part of the caliph's domain. Later, c. 13th century, the Turks and Afghans established the Delhi Sultanate. This was followed by the formation of sultanates in the Deccan and other parts of the subcontinent. Islam was an acknowledged religion of rulers in several areas. This continued with the establishment of the Mughal Empire in the 16th century as well as in many of the regional states that emerged in the 18th century. Theoretically, Muslim rulers were to be guided by the ulama, who were expected to ensure that they ruled according to the Sharia. Clearly, the situation was complicated in the subcontinent, where there were populations that did not subscribe to Islam. It is in this context that the category of the Tsimai, meaning protected, derived from the Arabic word tsima, protection, developed for peoples who followed revealed scriptures, such as the Jews and Christians, and lived under Muslim rulership. They paid a tax called jizya and gained the right to be protected by Muslims. In India this status was extended to Hindus as well. As you will see, rulers such as the Mughals came to regard themselves as emperors of not just Muslims but of all peoples. In effect, rulers often adopted a fairly flexible policy towards their subjects. For instance, several rulers gave land endowments and granted tax exemptions to Hindu, Jaina, Zoroastrian, Christian and Jewish religious institutions and also expressed respect and devotion towards non-Muslim religious leaders. These grants were made by several Mughal rulers, including Akbar and Aurangzeb. 5.2 The popular practice of Islam. The developments that followed the coming of Islam were not confined to ruling elites, in fact they permeated far and wide, through the subcontinent, amongst different social strata: peasants, artisans, warriors, merchants, to name a few. All those who adopted Islam accepted, in principle, the 5 pillars of the faith, that there is one God, Allah, and Prophet Muhammad is his messenger, Shahada, offering prayers 5 times a day, namaz/salat, giving alms, zakat, fasting during the month of Ramzan, Psalm, and performing the pilgrimage to Mecca, Hajj. However, these universal features were often overlaid with diversities in practice derived from sectarian affiliations, Sunni, Shia, and the influence of local customary practices of converts from different social milieus. For example, the Cholas, a branch of the Ismailis, a Shia sect, developed new modes of communication, disseminating ideas derived from the Quran through indigenous literary genres. These included the Jinan, derived from the Sanskrit Jnana, meaning knowledge, devotional poems in Punjabi, Multani, Sindhi, Kashchi, Hindi, and Gujarati, sung in special ragas during daily prayer meetings. Elsewhere, Arab Muslim traders who settled along the Malabar coast, Kerala, adopted the local language, Malayalam. They also adopted local customs such as matrilini and matrilocal residence. The complex blend of a universal faith with local traditions is perhaps best exemplified in the architecture of mosques. Some architectural features of mosques are universal, such as their orientation towards Mecca, evident in the placement of the mihrab, prayer niche, and the minbar, pulpit. However, there are several features that show variations, such as roofs and building materials. 5.3 Aims for communities. We often take the terms Hindu and Muslim for granted, as labels for religious communities. Yet, these terms did not gain currency for a very long time. Historians who have studied Sanskrit texts and inscriptions dating between the 8th and 14th centuries point out that the term Musulman or Muslim was virtually never used. Instead, people were occasionally identified in terms of the region from which they came. So, the Turkish rulers were designated as Turushka, Tajika were people from Tajikistan, and Parashika were people from Persia. Sometimes, terms used for other peoples were applied to the new migrants. For instance, the Turks and Afghans were referred to as Shakas and Yavanas, a term used for Greeks. A more general term for these migrant communities was Mlechha, indicating that they did not observe the norms of caste society and spoke languages that were not derived from Sanskrit. Such terms sometimes had a derogatory connotation, but they rarely denoted a distinct religious community of Muslims in opposition to Hindus. And as we saw, the term Hindu was used in a variety of ways, not necessarily restricted to a religious connotation. 6. The growth of Sufism. In the early centuries of Islam, a group of religious-minded people called Sufis turned to asceticism and mysticism in protest against the growing materialism of the caliphate as a religious and political institution. They were critical of the dogmatic definitions and scholastic methods of interpreting the Quran and Sunnah, traditions of the Prophet, adopted by theologians. Instead, they laid emphasis on seeking salvation through intense devotion and love for God by following His commands, and by following the example of the Prophet Muhammad, whom they regarded as a perfect human being. The Sufis thus sought an interpretation of the Quran on the basis of their personal experience. 6.1 Kankas and Silsilas. By the 11th century, Sufism evolved into a well-developed movement with a body of literature on Quranic studies and Sufi practices. Institutionally, the Sufis began to organize communities around the hospice or Kanka, Persian, controlled by a teaching master known as Sheikh, in Arabic, Pir or Murshid, in Persian. He enrolled disciples, murids, and appointed a successor, Khalifa. He established rules for spiritual conduct and interaction between inmates as well as between laypersons and the master. Sufi silsilas began to crystallize in different parts of the Islamic world around the 12th century. The word silsila literally means a chain, signifying a continuous link between master and disciple, stretching as an unbroken spiritual genealogy to the Prophet Muhammad. It was through this channel that spiritual power and blessings were transmitted to devotees. Special rituals of initiation were developed in which initiates took an oath of allegiance, wore a patched garment, and shaved their hair. When the sheikh died, his tomb shrine, dargah, a Persian term meaning court, became the center of devotion for his followers. This encouraged the practice of pilgrimage or ziyarat to his grave, particularly on his death anniversary or urs, or marriage, signifying the union of his soul with God. This was because people believed that in death saints were united with God, and were thus closer to Him than when living. People sought their blessings to attain material and spiritual benefits. Thus evolved the cult of the sheikh revered as Wali. 6.2 Outside the Kanka. Some mystics initiated movements based on a radical interpretation of Sufi ideals. Many scorned the Kanka and took to mendicancy and observed celibacy. They ignored rituals and observed extreme forms of asceticism. They were known by different names: calendars, madaris, malangs, Haidaris, etc. Because of their deliberate defiance of the Sharia, they were often referred to as Bashariya, in contrast to the Bashariya Sufis who complied with it. 7. The Chiefdoms in the subcontinent. Of the groups of Sufis who migrated to India in the late 12th century, the Chiefdoms were the most influential. This was because they adapted successfully to the local environment and adopted several features of Indian devotional traditions. 7.1 Life in the Kishti Kanka. The Kanka was the center of social life. We know about Sheikh Nizamuddin's hospice, c. 14th century, on the banks of the river Yamuna in Gyaspur, on the outskirts of what was then the city of Delhi. It comprised several small rooms and a big hall, Jama-at Khana, where the inmates and visitors lived and prayed. The inmates included family members of the sheikh, his attendants, and disciples. The sheikh lived in a small room on the roof of the hall where he met visitors in the morning and evening. A veranda surrounded the courtyard, and a boundary wall ran around the complex. On one occasion, fearing a Mongol invasion, people from the neighboring areas flocked into the Kanka to seek refuge. There was an open kitchen, langar, run on feuda, unasked for charity. From morning till late night, people from all walks of life, soldiers, slaves, singers, merchants, poets, travelers, rich and poor, Hindu yogis, yogi, and calendars came seeking discipleship, amulets for healing, and the intercession of the sheikh in various matters. Other visitors included poets such as Amir Hassan Siji and Amir Khusrau and the court historian Ziauddin Barani, all of whom wrote about the sheikh. Practices that were adopted, including bowing before the sheikh, offering water to visitors, shaving the heads of initiates, and yogic exercises, represented attempts to assimilate local traditions. Sheikh Nizamuddin appointed several spiritual successors and deputed them to set up hospices in various parts of the subcontinent. As a result, the teachings, practices, and organization of the Chiefdoms as well as the fame of the sheikh spread rapidly. This in turn drew pilgrims to his shrine, and also to the shrines of his spiritual ancestors. 7.2 Kishti Devotionalism, Ziyarat and Kawali. Pilgrimage, called ziyarat, to tombs of Sufi saints is prevalent all over the Muslim world. This practice is an occasion for seeking the Sufis' spiritual grace, barakat. For more than 7 centuries, people of various creeds, classes, and social backgrounds have expressed their devotion at the dargahs of the 5 great Kishti saints. Amongst these, the most revered shrine is that of Khwaja Muinuddin, popularly known as Gharib Nawaz, comforter of the poor. The earliest textual references to Khwaja Muinuddin's dargah date to the 14th century. It was evidently popular because of the austerity and piety of its sheikh, the greatness of his spiritual successors, and the patronage of royal visitors. Muhammad bin Tughlaq, ruled, 1324 to 1351, was the first sultan to visit the shrine, but the earliest construction to house the tomb was funded in the late 15th century by Sultan Ghiyasuddin Khalji of Malwa. Since the shrine was located on the trade route linking Delhi and Gujarat, it attracted a lot of travelers. By the 16th century the shrine had become very popular. In fact, it was the spirited singing of pilgrims bound for Ajmer that inspired Akbar to visit the tomb. He went there 14 times, sometimes 2 or 3 times a year, to seek blessings for new conquests, fulfillment of vows, and the birth of sons. He maintained this tradition until 1580. Each of these visits was celebrated by generous gifts, which were recorded in imperial documents. For example, in 1568 he offered a huge cauldron, deeg, to facilitate cooking for pilgrims. He also had a mosque constructed within the compound of the Dargah. Also part of NCERT is the use of music and dance, including mystical chants performed by specially trained musicians or qawwals to evoke divine ecstasy. The Sufis remember God either by reciting the zikr, the divine names, or evoking his presence through sama, literally, audition, or performance of mystical music. Sama was integral to the Qais, and exemplified interaction with indigenous devotional traditions. 7.3 Languages and Communication. It was not just in Sama that the Qais adopted local languages. In Delhi, those associated with the Kishti Silsila conversed in Hindavi, the language of the people. Other Sufis such as Baba Farid composed verses in the local language, which were incorporated in the Guru Granth Sahib. Yet others composed long poems or masnavis to express ideas of divine love using human love as an allegory. For example, the Premakian love story, Padmavat composed by Malik Muhammad Jayasi revolved around the romance of Padmini and Ratansan, the king of Chittor. Their trials were symbolic of the soul's journey to the divine. Such poetic compositions were often recited in hospices, usually during Sama. A different genre of Sufi poetry was composed in and around the town of Bijapur, Karnataka. These were short poems in Dakhani, a variant of Urdu, attributed to Kishti Sufis who lived in this region during the 17th and 18th centuries. These poems were probably sung by women while performing household chores like grinding grain and spinning. Other compositions were in the form of lurinama or lullabies and shadinama or wedding songs. It is likely that the Sufis of this region were inspired by the pre-existing Bhakta tradition of the Kannada Vachanas of the Lingayats and the Marathi Abhangs of the Sants of Pandharpa. It is through this medium that Islam gradually gained a place in the villages of the Deccan. 7.4 Sufis and the State. A major feature of the Kishti tradition was austerity, including maintaining a distance from worldly power. However, this was by no means a situation of absolute isolation from political power. The Sufis accepted unsolicited grants and donations from the political elites. The sultans in turn set up charitable trusts, Aqaf, as endowments for hospices and granted tax-free land, Inam. The Qais accepted donations in cash and kind. Rather than accumulate donations, they preferred to use these fully on immediate requirements such as food, clothes, living quarters, and ritual necessities, such as sama. All this enhanced the moral authority of the sheikhs, which in turn attracted people from all walks of life. Further, their piety and scholarship, and people's belief in their miraculous powers made Sufis popular among the masses, whose support kings wished to secure. Kings did not simply need to demonstrate their association with Sufis, they also required legitimation from them. When the Turks set up the Delhi Sultanate, they resisted the insistence of the ulama on imposing Sharia as state law because they anticipated opposition from their subjects, the majority of whom were non-Muslims. The sultans then sought out the Sufis who derived their authority directly from God and did not depend on jurists to interpret the Sharia. Besides, it was believed that the Awliya could intercede with God in order to improve the material and spiritual conditions of ordinary human beings. This explains why kings often wanted their tombs to be in the vicinity of Sufi shrines and hospices. However, there were instances of conflict between the sultans and the Sufis. To assert their authority, both expected that certain rituals be performed such as prostration and kissing of the feet. Occasionally the Sufi sheikh was addressed with high-sounding titles. For example, the disciples of Nizamuddin Aulia addressed him as Sultan ul-Mashaykh, literally, Sultan amongst sheikhs. 8. New devotional paths. Dialogue and descent in northern India. Many poet-saints engaged in explicit and implicit dialogue with these new social situations, ideas, and institutions. Let us now see how this dialogue found expression. We focus here on three of the most influential figures of the time. 8.1 Weaving a Divine Fabric, Kabir. Kabir, c. 14th–15th centuries, is perhaps one of the most outstanding examples of a poet-saint who emerged within this context. Historians have painstakingly tried to reconstruct his life and times through a study of compositions attributed to him as well as later hagiographies. Such exercises have proved to be challenging on a number of counts. Verses ascribed to Kabir have been compiled in three distinct but overlapping traditions. The Kabir Bijak is preserved by the Kabir Panth, the path or sect of Kabir, in Varanasi and elsewhere in Uttar Pradesh. The Kabir Granthavali is associated with the Dajapanth in Rajasthan, and many of his compositions are found in the Adi Granth Sahih. All these manuscript compilations were made long after the death of Kabir. By the 19th century, anthologies of verses attributed to him circulated in print in regions as far apart as Bengal, Gujarat, and Maharashtra. Kabir's poems have survived in several languages and dialects, and some are composed in the special language of Nirguna poets, the Sant Bhasha. Others, known as Ulat Bonsai, upside-down sayings, are written in a form in which everyday meanings are inverted. These hint at the difficulties of capturing the nature of the ultimate reality in words. Expressions such as the lotus which blooms without flower or the fire raging in the ocean convey a sense of Kabir's mystical experiences. Also striking is the range of traditions Kabir drew on to describe the ultimate reality. These include Islam. He described the ultimate reality as Allah, Khuda, Hazrat, and Pur. He also used terms drawn from Vedantic traditions, Alak, the unseen, Nirakar, formless, Brahman, Atman, etc. Other terms with mystical connotations such as Shavda, sound, or Shanya, emptiness, were drawn from yogic traditions. Diverse and sometimes conflicting ideas are expressed in these poems. Some poems draw on Islamic ideas and use monotheism and iconoclasm to attack Hindu polytheism and idol worship. Others use the Sufi concept of zikr and ishq, love, to express the Hindu practice of namsamaran, remembrance of God's name. Were all these composed by Kabir? We may never be able to tell with certainty, although scholars have tried to analyze the language, style, and content to establish which verses could be Kabir's. What this rich corpus of verses also signifies is that Kabir was and is to the present a source of inspiration for those who questioned entrenched religious and social institutions, ideas, and practices in their search for the divine. Just as Kabir's ideas probably crystallized through dialogue and debate, explicit or implicit, with the traditions of Sufis and yogis in the region of Awadh, part of present-day Uttar Pradesh, his legacy was claimed by several groups, who remembered him and continue to do so. This is most evident in later debates about whether he was a Hindu or a Muslim by birth, debates that are reflected in hagiographies. Many of these were composed from the 17th century onwards, about 200 years after Kabir's lifetime. Hagiographies within the Vaishnava tradition attempted to suggest that he was born a Hindu, Kabirdosh. Kabir itself is an Arabic word meaning great, but was raised by a poor Muslim family belonging to the community of weavers or Cholas, who were relatively recent converts to Islam. They also suggested that he was initiated into Bhakti by a guru, perhaps Ramananda. However, the verses attributed to Kabir use the words Guru and Satguru, but do not mention the name of any specific preceptor. Historians have pointed out that it is very difficult to establish that Ramananda and Kabir were contemporaries, without assigning improbably long lives to either or both. So, while traditions linking the two cannot be accepted at face value, they show how important the legacy of Kabir was for later generations. 8.2 Baba Guru Nanak and the Sacred Word. Baba Guru Nanak, 1469 to 1539, was born in a Hindu merchant family in a village called Nankana Sahib near the river Ravi in the predominantly Muslim Punjab. He trained to be an accountant and studied Persian. He was married at a young age, but he spent most of his time among Sufis and Bhaktas. He also travelled widely. The message of Baba Guru Nanak is spelt out in his hymns and teachings. These suggest that he advocated a form of nirguna bhakti. He firmly repudiated the external practices of the religions he saw around him. He rejected sacrifices, ritual baths, image worship, austerities and the scriptures of both Hindus and Muslims. For Baba Guru Nanak, the Absolute or Rab had no gender or form. He proposed a simple way to connect to the divine by remembering and repeating the divine name, expressing his ideas through hymns called Shabad in Punjabi, the language of the region. Baba Guru Nanak would sing these compositions in various ragas while his attendant Mardana played the rabab. Baba Guru Nanak organized his followers into a community. He set up rules for congregational worship, Sangat, involving collective recitation. He appointed one of his disciples, Angad, to succeed him as the preceptor, Guru, and this practice was followed for nearly 200 years. It appears that Baba Guru Nanak did not wish to establish a new religion, but after his death his followers consolidated their own practices and distinguished themselves from both Hindus and Muslims. The fifth preceptor, Guru Arjan, compiled Baba Guru Nanak's hymns along with those of his four successors and other religious poets like Baba Farid, Ravidas, also known as Radas, and Kabir in the Adi Granth Sahib. These hymns, called Gurbani, are composed in various languages. In the late 17th century the 10th preceptor, Guru Gobind Singh, included the compositions of the 9th Guru, Guru Tegh Bahadur, and this scripture was called the Guru Granth Sahib. Guru Gobind Singh also laid the foundation of the Khalsa Panth, Army of the Pure, and defined its 5 symbols: uncut hair, a dagger, a pair of shorts, a comb, and a steel bangle. Under him the community got consolidated as a socio-religious and military force. 8.3 Mirabai, the devotee princess. Mirabai, c. 15th–16th centuries, is perhaps the best-known woman poet within the Bhakta tradition. Biographies have been reconstructed primarily from the bhajans attributed to her, which were transmitted orally for centuries. According to these, she was a Rajput princess from Merta in Marwar who was married against her wishes to a prince of the Sisodia clan of Mewar, Rajasthan. She defied her husband and did not submit to the traditional role of wife and mother, instead recognizing Krishna, the avatar of Vishnu, as her lover. Her in-laws tried to poison her, but she escaped from the palace to live as a wandering singer composing songs that are characterized by intense expressions of emotion. According to some traditions, her preceptor was Radas, a leather worker. This would indicate her defiance of the norms of caste society. After rejecting the comforts of her husband's palace, she is supposed to have donned the white robes of a widow or the saffron robe of the renouncer. Although Mirabai did not attract a sect or group of followers, she has been recognized as a source of inspiration for centuries. Her songs continue to be sung by women and men, especially those who are poor and considered low caste in Gujarat and Rajasthan. 9. Reconstructing histories of religious traditions. We have seen that historians draw on a variety of sources to reconstruct histories of religious traditions. These include sculpture, architecture, stories about religious preceptors, compositions attributed to women and men engaged in the quest of understanding the nature of the divine. As we have seen in chapters 1 and 4, sculpture and architecture can only be understood if we have a grasp of the context, the ideas, beliefs, and practices of those who produced and used these images and buildings. What about textual traditions regarding religious beliefs? If you return to the sources in this chapter, you will notice that they include a wide variety, written in several different languages and styles. They range from the apparently simple, direct language of the Vachanas of Basavana to the ornate Persian of the Farman of the Mughal emperors. Understanding each type of text requires different skills. Apart from a familiarity with several languages, the historian has to be aware of the subtle variations in style that characterize each genre. Virtually all these religious traditions continue to flourish to date. This continuity has certain advantages for historians as it allows them to compare contemporary practices with those described in textual traditions or shown in old paintings and to trace changes. At the same time, because these traditions are part of people's lived beliefs and practices, there is often a lack of acceptance of the possibility that these may have changed over time. The challenge for historians is to undertake such investigations with sensitivity, while at the same time recognizing that religious traditions, like other traditions, are dynamic and change over time. Timeline. Some major religious teachers in the subcontinent. c. 500 to 800 CE Appar, Samba Ndar, Sundaramurti in Tamil Nadu. c. 800 to 900 Namalvar, Manikavakakar, Andal, Tondaradapadai in Tamil Nadu. c. 1000 to 1100 Al-Hujwiri, Data Genjay Bakshare in the Punjab, Ramanujakarya in Tamil Nadu. c. 1100 to 1200 Basavana in Karnataka. c. 1200 to 1300 Jainanadeva, Muddabai in Maharashtra, Khwaja Muinuddin Kishti in Rajasthan, Bahauddin Zakaria and Fariduddin Genjay I Shaker in the Punjab, Qutbuddin Bakhtiyar Kaki in Delhi. c. 1300 to 1400 Lal Ded in Kashmir, Lal Shahbaz Calendar in Sindh, Nizamuddin Aulia in Delhi, Ramananda in Uttar Pradesh, Chakamila in Maharashtra, Sharifuddin Yahya Mainari in Bihar. c. 1400 to 1500 Kabir, Radas, Surdash in Uttar Pradesh, Baba Guru Nanak in the Punjab, Vallabhacharya in Gujarat, Abdullah Shattari in Gwalior, Muhammad Shah Alam in Gujarat, Mir Syed Muhammad Gasu Deraz in Gulbarga, Shankaradeva in Assam, Tukaram in Maharashtra. c. 1500 to 1600 Sri Chaitanya in Bengal, Mirabai in Rajasthan, Sheikh Abdul Quddus Gangoi, Malik Muhammad Jayzi, Tulsidas in Uttar Pradesh. c. 1600 to 1700 Sheikh Ahmed Sarindi in Haryana, Mayan Mir in the Punjab. Great and Little Traditions. The terms Great and Little Traditions were coined by a sociologist named Robert Redfield in the 20th century to describe the cultural practices of peasant societies. He found that peasants observed rituals and customs that emanated from dominant social categories, including priests and rulers. These he classified as part of a great tradition. At the same time, peasants also followed local practices that did not necessarily correspond with those of the great tradition. These he included within the category of little tradition. He also noticed that both great and little traditions changed over time, through a process of interaction. While scholars accept the significance of these categories and processes, they are often uncomfortable with the hierarchy suggested by the terms great and little. The use of quotation marks for great and little is one way of indicating this. Source 1. The Chaturvedan, Brahmana versed in the four Vedas, and the outcast. This is an excerpt from a composition of an Alvar named Tondaradapadai, who was a Brahmana. You, Vishnu, manifestly like those servants who express their love for your feet, though they may be born outcasts, more than the Chaturvedans who are strangers and without allegiance to your service. Do you think Tondaradapadai was opposed to the caste system? Source 2. Shastras or Devotion. This is a verse composed by Appar, a Nayanar saint. O rogues who quote the logbooks, of what use are your Gotra and Kula? Just bow to Marpuris Lord, Shiva who resides in Marpuru, in Tanjavur, Tamil Nadu, as your sole refuge. Are there any similarities or differences in the attitudes of Tondaradapadai and Appar towards Brahmanas? Compilations of devotional literature. By the 10th century the compositions of the 12 Alvars were compiled in an anthology known as the 5 Alayara Divyaprabandham, 4,000 sacred compositions. The poems of Appar, Samba Ndar, and Sundarar form the Tavaram, a collection that was compiled and classified in the 10th century on the basis of the music of the songs. Source 3. A Demon. This is an excerpt from a poem by Karakal Amma in which she describes herself. The female Pei, Demonis, with bulging veins, protruding eyes, white teeth and shrunken stomach, red-haired and jutting teeth, lengthy shins extending till the ankles, shouts and wails while wandering in the forest. This is the forest of Alankatu, which is the home of our father, Shiva, who dances, with his matted hair thrown in all 8 directions, and with cool limbs. List the ways in which Karakal Amma depicts herself as presenting a contrast to traditional notions of feminine beauty. Source 4. Rituals and the Real World. Here is a vachana composed by Basavana. When they see a serpent carved in stone, they pour milk on it. If a real serpent comes, they say, "Kill! Kill!" To the servant of the god who could eat if served, they say, "Go away! Go away!" But to the image of the god which cannot eat, they offer dishes of food. Describe Basavana's attitude towards rituals. How does he attempt to convince the listener? Ulama, plural of alim, or one who knows, are scholars of Islamic studies. As preservers of this tradition, they perform various religious, juridical and teaching functions. Sharia. The Sharia is the law governing the Muslim community. It is based on the Quran and the Hadith, traditions of the Prophet, including a record of his remembered words and deeds. With the expansion of Islamic rule outside Arabia, in areas where customs and traditions were different, qiyas, reasoning by analogy, and ijma, consensus of the community, were recognized as 2 other sources of legislation. Thus, the Sharia evolved from the Quran, Hadith, qiyas, and ijma. Source 5. A Church in Combat. This is an excerpt from a Farman, Imperial Order, issued by Akbar in 1598. Whereas it reached our eminent and holy notice that the Padres, Fathers, of the Holy Society of Jesus wish to build a house of prayer, church, in the city of Kambaya, Kambat, in Gujarat, therefore an exalted mandate is being issued, that the dignitaries of the city of Kambaya should in no case stand in their way, but should allow them to build a church so that they may engage themselves in their own worship. It is necessary that the order of the emperor should be obeyed in every way. Who were the people from whom Akbar anticipated opposition to his order? Source 6. Reverence for the Yogi. Here is an excerpt from a letter written by Aurangzeb to a yogi in 1661 to 1662. The possessor of the sublime station, Shiv Murat, Guru Anand Nath Jio. May your reverence remain in peace and happiness ever under the protection of Sri Shiv Jio. A piece of cloth for the cloak and a sum of 25 rupees which have been sent as an offering will reach your reverence. Your reverence may write to us whenever there is any service which can be rendered by us. Identify the deity worshipped by the yogi. Describe the attitude of the emperor towards the yogi. Matrilocal residence is a practice where women after marriage remain in their natal home with their children and the husbands may come to stay with them. Matrilocal residence is a practice where women after marriage remain in their natal home with their children and the husbands may come to stay with them. Figure 6.11. The Shah Hamadan Mosque in Srinagar, on the banks of the Jhelum, is often regarded as the jewel in the crown of all the existing mosques of Kashmir. Built in 1395, it is one of the best examples of Kashmiri wooden architecture. Notice the spire and the beautifully carved eaves. It is decorated with papier-mâché. Sufism and Tasawwuf. Sufism is an English word coined in the 19th century. The word used for Sufism in Islamic texts is Tasawwuf. Historians have understood this term in several ways. According to some scholars, it is derived from Suf, meaning wool, referring to the coarse woolen clothes worn by Sufis. Others derive it from Safa, meaning purity. It may also have been derived from Sufa, the platform outside the Prophet's mosque, where a group of close followers assembled to learn about the faith. Aims of Silsilas. Most Sufi lineages were named after a founding figure. For example, the Qadiri order was named after Sheikh Abd ul-Qadir Jilani. However, some like the Kishti order, were named after their place of origin, in this case the town of Kisht in central Afghanistan. Wali, plural Aulia, or friend of God, was a Sufi who claimed proximity to Allah, acquiring His grace. Barakat, to perform miracles, Karamat. Major teachers of the Kishti Silsila. Sufi teachers. Year of death. Location of Dargah. Sheikh Muinuddin Siji. 1235. Ajmer, Rajasthan. Khwaja Qutbuddin Bakhtiyar Kaki. 1235. Delhi. Sheikh Fariduddin Ganji Shaker. 1265. Ajadan, Pakistan. Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia. 1325. Delhi. Sheikh Nasiruddin Khairagi Delhi. 1356. Delhi. The story of Data Genje Bakhsher. In 1039 Abu al-Hasan al-Hujwiri, a native of Hujwir near Ghazni in Afghanistan, was forced to cross the Indus as a captive of the invading Turkish army. He settled in Lahore and wrote a book in Persian called the Kashful Majub, Unveiling of the Veiled, to explain the meaning of Tasawwuf, and those who practiced it, that is, the Sufi. Hujwiri died in 1073 and was buried in Lahore. The grandson of Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni constructed a tomb over his grave, and this tomb shrine became a site of pilgrimage for his devotees, especially on his death anniversary. Even today Hujwiri is revered as Data Genje Bakhsher, or giver who bestows treasures, and his mausoleum is called Data Darbar, or Court of the Giver. Source 7. The Pilgrimage of the Mughal Princess Jahanara, 1643. The following is an excerpt from Jahanara's biography of Sheikh Muinuddin Kishti, titled Munis al-Arwa, the Confidant of Spirits. After praising the one God, this lowly fakira, humble soul, Jahanara, went from the capital Agra in the company of my great father, Emperor Shah Jahan, towards the pure region of incomparable Ajmer. I was committed to this idea, that every day in every station I would perform 2 cycles of optional prayer. For several days. I did not sleep on a leopard skin at night, I did not extend my feet in the direction of the blessed sanctuary of the revered Saving Master, and I did not turn my back towards him. I passed the days beneath the trees. On Thursday, the 4th of the blessed month of Ramzan, I attained the happiness of pilgrimage to the illuminated and the perfumed tomb. With an hour of daylight remaining, I went to the holy sanctuary and rubbed my pale face with the dust of that threshold. From the doorway to the blessed tomb I went barefoot, kissing the ground. Having entered the dome, I went around the light-filled tomb of my master 7 times. Finally, with my own hand I put the finest quality of attar on the perfumed tomb of the revered one, and having taken off the rose scarf that I had on my head, I placed it on the top of the blessed tomb. What are the gestures that Jahanara records to indicate her devotion to the Sheikh? How does she suggest that the Dargah was a special place? The lamp of the entire land. Each Sufi shrine was associated with distinctive features. This is what an 18th century visitor from the Deccan, Dargah Kulai Khan, wrote about the shrine of Nasiruddin Khairagi Delhi in his Murakhte Delhi album of Delhi. The Sheikh, in the grave, is not the lamp of Delhi but of the entire country. People turn up there in crowds, particularly on Sunday. In the month of Diwali the entire population of Delhi visits it and stays in tents around the spring tank for days. They take baths to obtain cures from chronic diseases. Muslims and Hindus pay visits in the same spirit. From morning till evening people come and also make themselves busy in merrymaking in the shade of the trees. Amir Khusrau and the Call. Amir Khusrau, 1253 to 1325, the great poet, musician, and disciple of Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia, gave a unique form to the Kishti Sama by introducing the Call, Arabic word meaning saying, a hymn sung at the opening or closing of Qawwali. This was followed by Sufi poetry in Persian, Hindavi, or Urdu, and sometimes using words from all of these languages. Qawwals, those who sing these songs, at the shrine of Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia always start their recital with the call. Today Qawwali is performed in shrines all over the subcontinent. Source 8. Charkhanama. A song set to the rhythm of the spinning wheel. As you take the cotton, you do zikri jolly. As you separate the cotton you should do zikri qalbi, and as you spool the thread you should do zikri. Any zikr should be uttered from the stomach through the chest and threaded through the throat. The threads of breath should be counted one by one, O sister. Up to 24,000. Do this day and night. And offer this to your pir as a gift. Sufis and the state. Other Sufis such as the Surawardi under the Delhi Sultans and the Naqshbandi under the Mughals were also associated with the state. However, the modes of their association were not the same as those of the Qais. In some cases, Sufis accepted courtly offices. Source 9. Declining a royal gift. This excerpt from a Sufi text describes the proceedings at Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia's hospice in 1313. I, the author, Amir Hassan Siji, had the good fortune of kissing his, Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia's, feet. At this time a local ruler had sent him the deed of ownership to 2 gardens and much land, along with the provisions and tools for their maintenance. The ruler had also made it clear that he was relinquishing all his rights to both the gardens and land. The master had not accepted that gift. Instead, he had lamented, "What have I to do with gardens and fields and lands? None of our spiritual masters had engaged in such activity." Then he told an appropriate story. Sultan Ghiyasuddin, who at that time was still known as Ulugh Khan, came to visit Sheikh Fariduddin, and offered some money and ownership deeds for 4 villages to the Sheikh, the money being for the benefit of the dervishes, Sufis, and the land for his use. Smiling, Sheikh al-Islam, Fariduddin, said, "Give me the money. I will dispense it to the dervishes. But as for those land deeds, keep them. There are many who long for them. Give them away to such persons." Source 10. The One Lord. Here is a composition attributed to Kabir. Tell me, brother, how can there be no one Lord of the world but 2? Who led you so astray? God is called by many names, names like Allah, Ram, Kareem, Keshav, Hari, and Hazrat. Gold may be shaped into rings and bangles. Is not it gold all the same? Distinctions are only words we invent. Kabir says they are both mistaken. Neither can find the only ram. One kills the goat, the other cows. They waste their lives in disputation. What is Kabir's argument against the distinction made between gods of different communities? Source 11. Love for the Lord. This is part of a song attributed to Marabai. I will build a funeral pyre of sandalwood and aloe, light it by your own hand. When I am burned away to cinders, smear this ash upon your limbs. Let flame be lost in flame. In another verse, she sings, "What can Mewar's ruler do to me? If God is angry, all is lost. But what can the Rana do? What does this indicate about Mirabai's attitude towards the king?" Shankaradeva. In the late 15th century, Shankaradeva emerged as one of the leading proponents of Vaishnavism in Assam. His teachings, often known as the Bhagavati Dharma because they were based on the Bhagavad Gita and the Bhagavata Purana, focused on absolute surrender to the supreme deity, in this case Vishnu. He emphasized the need for Nam Kirtan, recitation of the names of the Lord in satsanga or congregations of pious devotees. He also encouraged the establishment of satra or monasteries for the transmission of spiritual knowledge, and namgar or prayer halls. Many of these institutions and practices continue to flourish in the region. His major compositions include the Kirtanosha. Varieties of sources used to reconstruct the history of Sufi traditions. A wide range of texts were produced in and around Sufi Kankas. These included 1. Treatises or manuals dealing with Sufi thought and practices. The Kashful Majub of Ali bin Usman Hujwiri, died c. 1071, is an example of this genre. It enables historians to see how traditions outside the subcontinent influenced Sufi thought in India. 2. Malfuzat, literally, uttered, Conversations of Sufi Saints. An early text on Malfuzat is the Fawaid al-Fuad, a collection of conversations of Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia, compiled by Amir Hassan Siji Dehlavi, a noted Persian poet. Source 9 contains an excerpt from this text. Malfuzats were compiled by different Sufi silsilas with the permission of the sheikhs. These had obvious didactic purposes. Several examples have been found from different parts of the subcontinent, including the Deccan. They were compiled over several centuries. 3. Makshubat, literally, written collections of letters written by Sufi masters, addressed to their disciples and associates. While these tell us about the sheikh's experience of religious truth that he wanted to share with others, they also reflect the life conditions of the recipients and are responses to their aspirations and difficulties, both spiritual and mundane. The letters, known as Makshubati Imam Rabbani, of the noted 17th century Naqshbandi Sheikh Ahmad Sarindi, died. 1624, whose ideology is often contrasted with the liberal and non-sectarian views of Akbar, are amongst those most frequently discussed by scholars. 4. Tashkaras, literally, to mention and memorializa, biographical accounts of saints. The 14th century Siyar al-Aliya of Mir Kurd Kermani was the first Sufi tashkara written in India. It dealt principally with the Kishti saints. The most famous tashkara is the Akbar al-Akhyar of Abdul Haq Muhaddis Dehlavi, died. 1642. The authors of the tashkaras often sought to establish the precedence of their own orders and glorify their spiritual genealogies. Many details are often implausible, full of elements of the fantastic. Still, they are of great value for historians and help them to understand more fully the nature of the tradition. Remember that each of the traditions we have been considering in this chapter generated a wide range of textual and oral modes of communication, some of which have been preserved, many of which have been modified in the process of transmission, and others are probably lost forever. Theme 7. An imperial capital. Vijayanagara. c. 14th to 16th century. Vijayanagara, or City of Victory, was the name of both a city and an empire. The empire was founded in the 14th century. In its heyday it stretched from the river Krishna in the north to the extreme south of the peninsula. In 1565 the city was sacked and subsequently deserted. Although it fell into ruin in the 17th–18th centuries, it lived on in the memories of people living in the Krishna Tungabhadra Dub. They remembered it as Hampi, a name derived from that of the local mother goddess, Pampadevi. These oral traditions combined with archaeological finds, monuments and inscriptions and other records helped scholars to rediscover the Vijayanagara Empire. 1. The discovery of Hampi. The ruins at Hampi were brought to light in 1800 by an engineer and antiquarian named Colonel Colin Mackenzie. An employee of the English East India Company, he prepared the first survey map of the site. Much of the initial information he received was based on the memories of priests of the Virupaksha temple and the shrine of Pampadevi. Subsequently, from 1856, photographers began to record the monuments, which enabled scholars to study them. As early as 1836 epigraphists began collecting several dozen inscriptions found at this and other temples at Hampi. In an effort to reconstruct the history of the city and the empire, historians collated information from these sources with accounts of foreign travelers and other literature written in Telugu, Kannada, Tamil, and Sanskrit. 2. Rayas, Nayakas, and Sultans. According to tradition and epigraphic evidence, two brothers, Harihara and Bukka, founded the Vijayanagara Empire in 1336. This empire included within its fluctuating frontiers peoples who spoke different languages and followed different religious traditions. On their northern frontier, the Vijayanagara kings competed with contemporary rulers including the sultans of the Deccan and the Gajapati rulers of Orissa for control of the fertile river valleys and the resources generated by lucrative overseas trade. At the same time, interaction between these states led to sharing of ideas, especially in the field of architecture. The rulers of Vijayanagara borrowed concepts and building techniques which they then developed further. Karnataka Samrajyamu. While historians use the term Vijayanagara Empire, contemporaries described it as the Karnataka Samrajyamu. Some of the areas that were incorporated within the empire had witnessed the development of powerful states such as those of the Cholas in Tamil Nadu and the Hoysalas in Karnataka. Ruling elites in these areas had extended patronage to elaborate temples such as the Brihadishvara temple at Tanjavur and the Chinnakeshvara temple at Belur. The rulers of Vijayanagara, who called themselves Rayas, built on these traditions and carried them, as we will see, literally to new heights. 2.1 Kings and traders. As warfare during these times depended upon effective cavalry, the import of horses from Arabia and Central Asia was very important for rival kingdoms. This trade was initially controlled by Arab traders. Local communities of merchants known as Kudire Chettis or horse merchants also participated in these exchanges. From 1498 other actors appeared on the scene. These were the Portuguese, who arrived on the west coast of the subcontinent and attempted to establish trading and military stations. Their superior military technology, especially the use of muskets, enabled them to become important players in the tangled politics of the period. In fact, Vijayanagara was also noted for its markets dealing in spices, textiles, and precious stones. Trade was often regarded as a status symbol for such cities, which boasted of a wealthy population that demanded high-value exotic goods, especially precious stones and jewelry. The revenue derived from trade in turn contributed significantly to the prosperity of the state. 2.2 The apogee and decline of the empire. Within the polity, claimants to power included members of the ruling lineage as well as military commanders. The first dynasty, known as the Sangama dynasty, exercised control till 1485. They were supplanted by the Salyavas, military commanders, who remained in power till 1503 when they were replaced by the Tullavas. Krishnadevaraya belonged to the Tullava dynasty. Krishnadevaraya's rule was characterized by expansion and consolidation. This was the time when the land between the Tungabhadra and Krishna rivers, the Raichur Dub, was acquired. 1512, the rulers of Orissa were subdued. 1514, and severe defeats were inflicted on the Sultan of Bijapur. 1520. Although the kingdom remained in a constant state of military preparedness, it flourished under conditions of unparalleled peace and prosperity. Krishnadevaraya is credited with building some fine temples and adding impressive gopurams to many important South Indian temples. He also founded a suburban township near Vijayanagara called Nagalapuram after his mother. Some of the most detailed descriptions of Vijayanagara come from his time or just after. Strain began to show within the imperial structure following Krishnadevaraya's death in 1529. His successors were troubled by rebellious Nayakas or military chiefs. By 1542, control at the center had shifted to another ruling lineage, that of the Aravidu, which remained in power till the end of the 17th century. During this period, as indeed earlier, the military ambitions of the rulers of Vijayanagara as well as those of the Deccan sultanates resulted in shifting alignments. Eventually this led to an alliance of the sultanates against Vijayanagara. In 1565 Ramaraya, the chief minister of Vijayanagara, led the army into battle at Rakshasi Tangati, also known as Talikota, where his forces were routed by the combined armies of Bijapur, Ahmednagar, and Golconda. The victorious armies sacked the city of Vijayanagara. The city was totally abandoned within a few years. Now the focus of the empire shifted to the east where the Aravidu dynasty ruled from Panakonda and later from Chandragiri, near Tirupati. Although the armies of the sultans were responsible for the destruction of the city of Vijayanagara, relations between the sultans and the reyes were not always or inevitably hostile, in spite of religious differences. Krishnadeva Raya, for example, supported some claimants to power in the sultanates and took pride in the title establisher of the Yavana kingdom. Similarly, the Sultan of Bijapur intervened to resolve succession disputes in Vijayanagara following the death of Krishnadeva Raya. In fact, the Vijayanagara kings were keen to ensure the stability of the sultanates and vice versa. It was the adventurous policy of Ramaraya, who tried to play off one sultan against another, that led the sultans to combine together and decisively defeat him. 2.3 The Reyes and the Nayakas. Among those who exercised power in the empire were military chiefs who usually controlled forts and had armed supporters. These chiefs often moved from one area to another, and in many cases were accompanied by peasants looking for fertile land on which to settle. These chiefs were known as Nayakas, and they usually spoke Telugu or Kannada. Many Nayakas submitted to the authority of the kings of Vijayanagara, but they often rebelled and had to be subdued by military action. The Amarana Yaka system was a major political innovation of the Vijayanagara Empire. It is likely that many features of this system were derived from the Ikta system of the Delhi Sultanate. The Amarana Yakas were military commanders who were given territories to govern by the Raya. They collected taxes and other dues from peasants, craftspersons, and traders in the area. They retained part of the revenue for personal use and for maintaining a stipulated contingent of horses and elephants. These contingents provided the Vijayanagara kings with an effective fighting force with which they brought the entire southern peninsula under their control. Some of the revenue was also used for the maintenance of temples and irrigation works. The Amarana Yakas sent tribute to the king annually and personally appeared in the royal court with gifts to express their loyalty. Kings occasionally asserted their control over them by transferring them from one place to another. However, during the course of the 17th century, many of these Nayakas established independent kingdoms. This hastened the collapse of the central imperial structure. 3. Vijayanagara. The capital and its environs. Like most capitals, Vijayanagara was characterized by a distinctive physical layout and building style. 3.1 Water resources. The most striking feature about the location of Vijayanagara is the natural basin formed by the river Tungabhadra, which flows in a northeasterly direction. The surrounding landscape is characterized by stunning granite hills that seem to form a girdle around the city. A number of streams flow down to the river from these rocky outcrops. In almost all cases, embankments were built along these streams to create reservoirs of varying sizes. As this is one of the most arid zones of the peninsula, elaborate arrangements had to be made to store rainwater and conduct it to the city. The most important such tank was built in the early years of the 15th century and is now called Kamalapuram Tank. Water from this tank not only irrigated fields nearby but was also conducted through a channel to the royal center. One of the most prominent waterworks to be seen among the ruins is the Hyria Canal. This canal drew water from a dam across the Tungabhadra and irrigated the cultivated valley that separated the sacred center from the urban core. This was apparently built by kings of the Sangama dynasty. 3.2 Fortifications and roads. Before we examine the different parts of the city in detail, let us look at what enclosed them all: the great fortress walls. Abdur Razak, an ambassador sent by the ruler of Persia to Calicut, present-day Kozhikode, in the 15th century, was greatly impressed by the fortifications, and mentioned 7 lines of forts. These encircled not only the city but also its agricultural hinterland and forests. The outermost wall linked the hills surrounding the city. The massive masonry construction was slightly tapered. No mortar or cementing agent was employed anywhere in the construction. The stone blocks were wedge-shaped, which held them in place, and the inner portion of the walls was of earth packed with rubble. Square or rectangular bastions projected outwards. What was most significant about this fortification is that it enclosed agricultural tracts. Abdur Razak noted that between the first, second, and the third walls there are cultivated fields, gardens and houses. And Pais observed, from this first circuit until you enter the city there is a great distance, in which are fields in which they sow rice and have many gardens and much water, in which Water comes from 2 lakes. These statements have been corroborated by present-day archaeologists, who have also found evidence of an agricultural tract between the sacred center and the urban core. This tract was serviced by an elaborate canal system drawing water from the Tungabhadra. Why do you think agricultural tracts were incorporated within the fortified area? Often, the objective of medieval sieges was to starve the defenders into submission. These sieges could last for several months and sometimes even years. Normally rulers tried to be prepared for such situations by building large granaries within fortified areas. The rulers of Vijayanagara adopted a more expensive and elaborate strategy of protecting the agricultural belt itself. A second line of fortification went round the inner core of the urban complex, and a third line surrounded the royal center, within which each set of major buildings was surrounded by its own high walls. The fort was entered through well-guarded gates, which linked the city to the major roads. Gateways were distinctive architectural features that often defined the structures to which they regulated access. The arch on the gateway leading into the fortified settlement as well as the dome over the gate are regarded as typical features of the architecture introduced by the Turkish sultans. Art historians refer to this style as Indo-Islamic, as it grew continually through interaction with local building practices in different regions. Archaeologists have studied roads within the city and those leading out from it. These have been identified by tracing paths through gateways, as well as by finds of pavements. Roads generally wound around through the valleys, avoiding rocky terrain. Some of the most important roads extended from temple gateways, and were lined by bazaars. 3.3 The urban core. Moving along the roads leading into the urban core, there is relatively little archaeological evidence of the houses of ordinary people. Archaeologists have found fine Chinese porcelain in some areas, including in the northeastern corner of the urban core, and suggest that these areas may have been occupied by rich traders. This was also the Muslim residential quarter. Tombs and mosques located here have distinctive functions, yet their architecture resembles that of the mandapas found in the temples of Hampi. This is how the 16th century Portuguese traveller Barbosa described the houses of ordinary people, which have not survived. The other houses of the people are thatched, but nonetheless well built and arranged according to occupations, in long streets with many open places. Field surveys indicate that the entire area was dotted with numerous shrines and small temples, pointing to the prevalence of a variety of cults, perhaps supported by different communities. The surveys also indicate that wells, rainwater tanks as well as temple tanks may have served as sources of water to the ordinary town dwellers. 4. The Royal Center. The Royal Center was located in the southwestern part of the settlement. Although designated as a royal center, it included over 60 temples. Clearly, the patronage of temples and cults was important for rulers who were trying to establish and legitimize their authority through association with the divinities housed in the shrines. About 30 building complexes have been identified as palaces. These are relatively large structures that do not seem to have been associated with ritual functions. One difference between these structures and temples is that the latter were constructed entirely of masonry, while the superstructure of the secular buildings was made of perishable materials. 4.1 The Mahanavamaya Dibba. Some of the more distinctive structures in the area have been assigned names based on the form of the buildings as well as their functions. The King's Palace is the largest of the enclosures but has not yielded definitive evidence of being a royal residence. It has 2 of the most impressive platforms, usually called the Audience Hall and the Mahanavamaya Dibba. The entire complex is surrounded by high double walls with a street running between them. The Audience Hall is a high platform with slots for wooden pillars at close and regular intervals. It had a staircase going up to the second floor, which rested on these pillars. The pillars being closely spaced, would have left little free space, and thus it is not clear what the hall was used for. Located on one of the highest points in the city, the Mahanavamaya Dibba is a massive platform rising from a base of about 11,000 sq ft to a height of 40 feet. There is evidence that it supported a wooden structure. The base of the platform is covered with relief carvings. Rituals associated with the structure probably coincided with Mahanavamaya, literally, the Great Ninth Day, of the Tendai Hindu festival during the autumn months of September and October, known variously as Dasra, Northern India, Durga Puja, in Bengal, and Navaratri or Mahanavami, in peninsular India. The Vijayanagara kings displayed their prestige, power, and suzerainty on this occasion. The ceremonies performed on the occasion included worship of the image, worship of the state horse, and the sacrifice of buffaloes and other animals. Dances, wrestling matches, and processions of caparisoned horses, elephants, and chariots and soldiers, as well as ritual presentations before the king and his guests by the chief Nayakas and subordinate kings marked the occasion. These ceremonies were imbued with deep symbolic meanings. On the last day of the festival, the king inspected his army and the armies of the Nayakas in a grand ceremony in an open field. On this occasion the Nayakas brought rich gifts for the king as well as the stipulated tribute. Was the Mahanavami Dibba that stands today the center of this elaborate ritual? Scholars have pointed out that the space surrounding the structure does not seem to have been adequate for elaborate processions of armed men, women, and large numbers of animals. Like some of the other structures in the royal center, it remains an enigma. 4.2 Other buildings in the royal center. One of the most beautiful buildings in the royal center is the Lotus Mahal, so named by British travelers in the 19th century. While the name is certainly romantic, historians are not quite sure what the building was used for. One suggestion, found in a map drawn by Mackenzie, is that it may have been a council chamber, a place where the king met his advisors. While most temples were located in the sacred center, there were several in the royal center as well. One of the most spectacular of these is one known as the Hazara Rama Temple. This was probably meant to be used only by the king and his family. The images in the central shrine are missing, however, sculpted panels on the walls survive. These include scenes from the Ramayana sculpted on the inner walls of the shrine. While many of the structures at Vijayanagara were destroyed when the city was sacked, traditions of building palatial structures were continued by the Nayakas. Many of these buildings have survived. 5. The Sacred Center. 5.1 Choosing a capital. We now move to the rocky northern end of the city on the banks of the Tungabhadra. According to local tradition, these hills sheltered the monkey kingdom of Vala and Sugriva mentioned in the Ramayana. Other traditions suggest that Pampadevi, the local mother goddess, did penance in these hills in order to marry Virupaksha, the guardian deity of the kingdom, also recognized as a form of Shiva. To this day this marriage is celebrated annually in the Virupaksha temple. Among these hills are found Jaina temples of the pre-Vijayanagara period as well. In other words, this area was associated with several sacred traditions. Temple building in the region had a long history, going back to dynasties such as the Pallavas, Chalukyas, Hoysalas, and Cholas. Rulers very often encouraged temple building as a means of associating themselves with the divine. Often, the deity was explicitly or implicitly identified with the king. Temples also functioned as centers of learning. Besides, rulers and others often granted land and other resources for the maintenance of temples. Consequently, temples developed as significant religious, social, cultural and economic centers. From the point of view of the rulers, constructing, repairing and maintaining temples were important means of winning support and recognition for their power, wealth, and piety. It is likely that the very choice of the site of Vijayanagara was inspired by the existence of the shrines of Virupaksha and Pampadevi. In fact, the Vijayanagara kings claimed to rule on behalf of the god Virupaksha. All royal orders were signed Sri Virupaksha, usually in the Kannada script. Rulers also indicated their close links with the gods by using the title Hindu Suratrana. This was a Sanskritization of the Arabic term sultan, meaning king, so it literally meant Hindu sultan. Even as they drew on earlier traditions, the rulers of Vijayanagara innovated and developed these. Royal portrait sculpture was now displayed in temples, and the king's visits to temples were treated as important state occasions on which he was accompanied by the important Nayakas of the empire. 5.2. Gopurams and Mandapas. In terms of temple architecture, by this period certain new features were in evidence. These included structures of immense scale that must have been a mark of imperial authority, best exemplified by the Raya Gopurams or royal gateways that often dwarfed the towers on the central shrines, and signaled the presence of the temple from a great distance. They were also probably meant as reminders of the power of kings, able to command the resources, techniques, and skills needed to construct these towering gateways. Other distinctive features include mandapas or pavilions and long, pillared corridors that often ran around the shrines within the temple complex. Let us look at two temples more closely: the Virupaksha temple and the Vithala temple. The Virupaksha temple was built over centuries. While inscriptions suggest that the earliest shrine dated to the 9th–10th centuries, it was substantially enlarged with the establishment of the Vijayanagara Empire. The hall in front of the main shrine was built by Krishnadeva Raya to mark his accession. This was decorated with delicately carved pillars. He is also credited with the construction of the Eastern Gopuram. These additions meant that the central shrine came to occupy a relatively small part of the complex. The halls in the temple were used for a variety of purposes. Some were spaces in which the images of gods were placed to witness special programs of music, dance, drama, etc. Others were used to celebrate the marriages of deities, and yet others were meant for the deities to swing in. Special images, distinct from those kept in the small central shrine, were used on these occasions. Another shrine, the Vithala temple, is also interesting. Here, the principal deity was Vithala, a form of Vishnu generally worshipped in Maharashtra. The introduction of the worship of the deity in Karnataka is another indication of the ways in which the rulers of Vijayanagara drew on different traditions to create an imperial culture. As in the case of other temples, this temple too has several halls and a unique shrine designed as a chariot. A characteristic feature of the temple complexes is the chariot streets that extended from the temple gopuram in a straight line. These streets were paved with stone slabs and lined with pillared pavilions in which merchants set up their shops. Just as the Nayakas continued with and elaborated on traditions of fortification, so they did with traditions of temple building. In fact, some of the most spectacular gopurams were also built by the local Nayakas. 6. Plotting palaces, temples, and bazaars. We have been examining a wealth of information on Vijayanagara photographs, plans, elevations of structures and sculpture. How was all of this produced? After the initial surveys by Mackenzie, information was pieced together from travelers' accounts and inscriptions. Through the 20th century, the site was preserved by the Archaeological Survey of India and the Karnataka Department of Archaeology and Museums. In 1976, Hampi was recognized as a site of national importance. Then, in the early 1980s, an important project was launched to document the material remains at Vijayanagara in detail, through extensive and intensive surveys, using a variety of recording techniques. Over nearly 20 years, dozens of scholars from all over the world worked to compile and preserve this information. Let us look at just one part of this enormous exercise, mapping in more detail. The first step was to divide the entire area into a set of 25 squares, each designated by a letter of the alphabet. Then, each of the small squares was subdivided into a set of even smaller squares. But this was not all, each of these smaller squares was further subdivided into yet smaller units. As you can see, these detailed surveys have been extremely painstaking, and have recovered and documented traces of thousands of structures from tiny shrines and residences to elaborate temples. They have also led to the recovery of traces of roads, paths, bazaars, etc. The latter have been located through finds of pillar bases and platforms, all that remain of thriving markets. It is worth remembering something that John M. Fritz, George Mitchell, and M.S. Nagaraja Rao, who worked for years at the site, wrote, "In our study of these monuments of Vijayanagara we have to imagine a whole series of vanished wooden elements, columns, brackets, beams, ceilings, overhanging eaves, and towers decorated with plaster and painted, perhaps brightly. Although wooden structures are lost, and only stone structures survive, the descriptions left by travelers allow us to reconstruct some aspects of the vibrant life of the times." 7. Questions in Search of answers. Buildings that survive tell us about the way spaces were organized and used, how they were built, with what materials and techniques. For example, we can assess the defense requirements and military preparedness of a city by studying its fortifications. Buildings also tell us about the spread of ideas and cultural influences if we compare them with buildings in other places. They convey ideas which the builders or their patrons wished to project. They are often suffused with symbols which are a product of their cultural context. These we can understand when we combine information from other sources like literature, inscriptions, and popular traditions. Investigations of architectural features do not tell us what ordinary men, women, and children, comprising the vast majority of the people who lived in the city and its outskirts, thought about these impressive buildings. Would they have had access to any of the areas within the royal center or the sacred center? Would they hurry past the sculpture, or would they pause to see, reflect, and try and understand its complicated symbolism? And what did the people who worked on these colossal construction projects think of the enterprises to which they had contributed their labor? While rulers took all important decisions about the buildings to be constructed, the site, the material to be used and the style to be followed, who possessed the specialized knowledge required for such enormous enterprises? Who drew up the plans for the buildings? Where did the masons, stonecutters, sculptors who did the actual building come from? Were they captured during war from neighboring regions? What kind of wages did they get? Who supervised the building activity? How was building material transported and where did it come from? These are some of the questions that we cannot answer by merely looking at the buildings or their remains. Continuing research using other sources might provide some further clues. Timeline 1. Major political developments. c. 1200 to 1300 Establishment of the Delhi Sultanate, 1206. c. 1300 to 1400 Establishment of the Vijayanagara Empire, 1336, Establishment of the Bahmani Kingdom, 1347, Sultanates in Jaunpur, Kashmir, and Madura. c. 1400 to 1500 Establishment of the Gajapati Kingdom of Orissa, 1435, Establishment of the Sultanates of Gujarat and Malwa, Emergence of the Sultanates of Ahmednagar, Bijapur, and Berar, 1490. c. 1500 to 1600 Conquest of Goa by the Portuguese, 1510, Collapse of the Bahmani Kingdom. Emergence of the Sultanate of Golconda, 1518, Establishment of the Mughal Empire by Babur, 1526. Timeline 2. Landmarks in the discovery and conservation of Vijayanagara. 1800 Colin Mackenzie visits Vijayanagara. 1856 Alexander Greenlaw takes the first detailed photographs of archaeological remains at Hampi. 1876 J.F. Fleet begins documenting the inscriptions on the temple walls at the site. 1902 Conservation begins under John Marshall. 1986 Hampi declared a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. Source 1. Colin Mackenzie. Born in 1754, Colin Mackenzie became famous as an engineer, surveyor, and cartographer. In 1815 he was appointed the first Surveyor General of India, a post he held till his death in 1821. He embarked on collecting local histories and surveying historic sites in order to better understand India's past and make governance of the colony easier. He says that it struggled long under the miseries of bad management, before the South came under the benign influence of the British government. By studying Vijayanagara, Mackenzie believed that the East India Company could gain much useful information on many of these institutions, laws, and customs whose influence still prevails among the various tribes of natives forming the general mass of the population to this day. Elephants, horses, and men. Gajapati literally means Lord of Elephants. This was the name of a ruling lineage that was very powerful in Orissa in the 15th century. In the popular traditions of Vijayanagara, the Deccan Sultans are termed as Ashvapati or Lord of Horses, and the Rayas are called Narapati or Lord of Men. Source 2. Kings and Traders. Krishnadeva Raya, ruled 1509 to 1529, the most famous ruler of Vijayanagara, composed a work on statecraft in Telugu known as the Amutamalyada. About traders he wrote, "A king should improve the harbours of his country and so encourage its commerce that horses, elephants, precious gems, sandalwood, pearls, and other articles are freely imported. He should arrange that the foreign sailors who land in his country on account of storms, illness and exhaustion are looked after in a suitable manner. Make the merchants of distant foreign countries who import elephants and good horses be attached to yourself by providing them with daily audience, presents and allowing decent profits.